David walked down the familiar street holding his son's hand. Brian was thinking aloud about something. From time to time, he raised his head and looked at his father with a smile, turning to him with the same question. "Yes, Dad?" David automatically smiled and replied, "Yes, my son." He didn't hear what Brian was telling him, as his mind was consumed by memories of the days when he himself asked endless questions to his foster father, who had successfully replaced his biological father. David walked to a large playground surrounded by benches, many of which were occupied. David chose one free bench and walked over to it with his son. "Go play, and I'll sit here for a while." Brian laughed merrily and skipped to the playground, where there were many children of different ages. While Brian was playing and having fun, David was reminiscing. David's parents died in the accident. When this happened, the boy was not even 3 years old. He had only one grandmother. He couldn't take the boy for herself, as she was in poor health. David ended up in an orphanage. Soon, the grandmother died. Her health deteriorated greatly after the events with David's parents. Grief completely consumed her mind and soul. After some time, David got into the family of Tori and Rick, and they became his adoptive parents. David was 3 years old, and he became very attached to his new parents, fell in love with them, called Mom and Dad, and they loved him very much. But a few years later, a new misfortune happened. David's adoptive mother had an accident. This was a real tragedy for Rick and for the little boy. David again lost his footing, but he still had a father whom he adored, and Rick couldn't cope with grief and began to drink alcohol heavily. After a while, their female neighbor tried to talk to Rick. She chose the moment when the man was in a normal state and said, "Rick, come to your senses. Your son is growing up, but you don't see him at close range. You'll lose the boy if you don't get smart." Rick sullenly replied, "You mind your own business. I myself will figure out what to do." The female neighbor was terribly offended and turned to guardianship. She reported the situation to them, and a few days later, David was taken back to the orphanage. The boy was crying terribly when he was taken away. He grabbed his father and shouted loudly, "Daddy, don't give me away. I don't want to leave. Please don't give me away." Rick frowned and didn't quite realize what was happening. "Son, they'll look after you for now, and I'll pick you up soon. Don't be afraid, just wait a bit." The boy looked at him with trusting eyes and begged, Do you promise you'll pick me up from there? I don't want to be without you." Rick hugged the boy, and then David was taken away. Every day he sat at the window, waiting for his father. The hope in his eyes faded more and more every day. He waited a week, a month, half a year, but his father didn't return for him, and David was given to another family. The boy was taken to another city and lost touch with his past life. A month ago, he returned to his hometown. Many years later, he already has his own family, a son. He will soon have a daughter. His second adoptive parents turned out to be good people. They loved him and treated him very well. But David remembered all his life about Rick, his father, who never took him from the shelter. He was deeply offended at him for not returning for him, and he decided that he would find out everything to the end. He came to the house of his first adoptive parents, but he didn't find anyone there. The female neighbor said that a man lived there whose child was once taken away, and then this man became seriously ill. He was diagnosed with cancer. Apparently, the departure of his wife so knocked him down and provoked the disease. The man had to sell the apartment in order to go to another city for treatment. Nobody knew what happened to him next. Thus, David learned that his father didn't take him away due to forced circumstances, and not because he forgot about him. Most likely, he is no longer in this world, but now he can't even find his father's grave to kneel over his last resting place. Brian laughed out loud, and David woke up from the memory. He looked around. People were walking back and forth, each doing his own thing. Someone was just walking. Someone was in a hurry to get home from work. Everyone had their own life. He sighed heavily. Meanwhile, Rick was sitting on a bench and looked sullenly at the passers-by. Sad thoughts overwhelmed him. It became very difficult for him. It's difficult for him to walk and cook. He probably needs to hire an assistant, but he has nothing to pay since he barely has enough money to live. Medicines are too expensive, so he spends most of his money on them. If only he had someone. He remembered his wife and how they wanted children. When their daughter was born, they were so happy. But the child didn't live up to 2 years due to illness. Tori was no longer able to give birth, and they steadfastly endured all the hardships of life. They had the courage and strength to take a foster child. They adopted a boy who was 3 years old. This unfortunate child was left without parents by a tragic accident. Tori and Rick immediately fell in love with him. Everything was fine at first. The boy grew up in love and harmony. He always smiled, laughed, and he also fell in love with his new father and mother. The boy became especially attached to his father. He never left his side when Rick was at home. And then misfortune happened. Tori died and Rick began to drink alcohol regularly. The boy was taken to an orphanage because Rick couldn't pay attention to him. In addition, he lost his job due to a new lifestyle. At first, Rick was glad that the boy was taken away, as his grief over the loss of his wife was too great for him to think about anything else. And it's not known how everything would have ended if, a month later, Rick had not accidentally crushed a toy car that fell under his feet. The crunch of the toy brought him to his senses, and he seemed to get out of the swamp and take a breath of fresh air. He burst into tears, looking at the crushed typewriter in his hands. Rick screamed, shedding tears. "What am I doing? Tori would never forgive me for this. I need to pick up David from the shelter." When Rick calmed down, he decided that he needed to find a job first, but the next day, he felt bad. He felt so bad that he asked a female neighbor to call an ambulance. He was taken to the hospital, and a few days later, he learned that he had a terrible disease. The cancer was eating him up from the inside. He needed a large sum and an operation in another city to recover. Rick made the decision to sell his apartment to the first buyer who came to see it. He knew that every day was precious to him. Then he left the city. He promised himself that he would stay alive and then come back for David. The surgery and recovery period took about a year. A year later, he returned for his adopted son, but he was in for a terrible disappointment. David was adopted a few months ago and taken to another city. He didn't get any more information because it wasn't allowed. Rick realized that he would never see his beloved son again. Many years passed since those events, but the memories of his adopted son still haunted him. He knew that only he was to blame for everything, and every day he reproached himself for it. Rick never remarried. Rick wiped away his tears and silently looked at the playground where the kids were running around. He dreamed of grandchildren just as he once dreamed of a son, but none of his dreams came true. One boy threw a rubber ball and it rolled at Rick's feet. The boy ran up to an elderly man and said, "Grandfather, I'll take my ball. It's under your feet." Rick moved his legs to the side and said, "Take it, of course." Brian took the ball and threw it into the court for the other boys. He wanted to leave, but suddenly stopped. He turned back to the old man and said, "Are you crying because I hit you with the ball?" Rick wiped away his tears and grinned. "I'm not crying. It's just that the sun is shining in my eyes, so my eyes watered. It's hot today, and I'm very thirsty. If I give you money, can you buy me some water at that kiosk?" "No, my dad doesn't allow me to leave the site. I'd rather ask him, and he will buy to you. I'm coming now. Wait for me." Rick didn't have time to say anything as the boy raced away. Brian approached his father. "Dad, there is an old grandfather sitting there, and he is very thirsty. Can we buy him some water and some pie? I think he is very unhappy because he has tears in his eyes. I want to do something nice for him." David smiled because they raised a good son. A kind boy respects the elderly. David bought a pie and a bottle of drinking water at the kiosk. He handed them to his son, who ran to the old man. David followed him. When he approached the bench, his son was already sitting next to the old man. The elderly man held a pie in one hand and a bottle of water in the other. David greeted and sat down next to his son. "Young man, you have a good son. I am surprised by his kindness. It's so unusual these days. Once I also had a son, only I lost him through my own stupidity." David looked at the older man's profile with interest. There was a silence, and David broke down and said, "What happened to him? How did you lose it?" "Forgive my curiosity, it doesn't concern me." But the old man immediately reassured him. "No, everything is fine. I started this conversation myself. He is alive, and I really hope so, but I don't know anything about his fate." David looked at the old man with even more curiosity, who continued, "My wife and I adopted him, and then my wife died in an accident, and I, the fool, began to drink alcohol, and it was taken from me. But the disease knocked me down, and when I recovered and came to the orphanage to take my son back, it was already too late, since he had already been adopted. That's it." There was a silence again. David looked at the old man, tears welling up in his eyes, and he was barely breathing. After a few minutes, he found the strength to ask the old man, "What was your wife's name again?" His voice sounded muffled and broken, but Rick paid no attention to it. He said, "My wife's name was Tori, and my son's name was David." David whispered softly, "Daddy, is that really you?" The old man turned sharply towards David, looked into his eyes, and in a moment his lips trembled, and he said as quietly as David, "David, son, is that really you?" Brian sat between the older man and his father and looked curiously from one to the other, and he loudly said, "Daddy, have we found our grandfather?" David didn't say anything. He just jumped up from the bench and knelt before the old man. Rick put his hands on David's head and closed his eyes. Tears dripped from his gray eyelashes. These were tears of happiness, happiness from the fact that he met his beloved